Welcome to another episode of Chax Chat. Join Chad Chilius and me, Dax Castro, where each week we wax poetic about document accessibility topics, tips, and the struggle of remediation and compliance. So sit back, grab your favorite mug of whatever, and let's get started.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Chax Chat podcast. My name is Chad Chilius. I'm an Adobe certified instructor and one of the accessibility wizards at Chax Training and Consulting.
And my name is Dax Castro. I am also an accessibility specialist here at Chax Training and Consulting. And Chad and I are both certified as accessible document specialists. And if you'd like your certification, head on over to accessibilityassociation.org/certifications and check out the IAAP certifications there for accessible document specialist or web accessibility specialist, or even the CPAC, and get more information about that. So awesome. How you doing, Chad?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Not too bad. Excited for Adobe Max coming up, right?
It is coming up. End of October, right?
Yes.
So you and I are currently, preparing for that. We're getting our sessions ready. We're both doing a lab this year, right? I'm doing a lab entitled Designing with Accessibility in Mind using Adobe InDesign. And your session is?
It is a beautiful, accessible design. It's a lot longer title than that, but the idea here, it's an Illustrator lab. So it's a 90-minute, they're 90 minutes, right? Are they 90 minutes? Yeah, 90-minute lab that is about using Illustrator, of all tools, to create accessible and beautiful designs, which is, for those of you who are listening, might be going, bullshit. Illustrator doesn't create accessible designs. You're correct in that it can't export a PDF that is accessible, but you can build a file in Illustrator that utilizes kind of the prep work you need to create an accessible PDF file. And so the session focuses on teaching you how to do things like use color correctly, color contrast, fonts, and some of the basic stuff, but also kind of the ins and outs of what you need to know about creating an Illustrator file in a way that either can be used as a standalone PDF or as a placed object inside of programs like InDesign or other programs. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm excited because a lot of people, they have that myth, right? That accessibility has to be dumb or boring, or you can't make it exciting. And I've got a really good sample file that's going to allow people to really, really blossom and see a difference, I think. Accessibility and beautiful can be in the same sentence.
Yeah. I'm sure you're going to be covering a lot of great topics like minimum color contrast and colorblind friendly colors. And that'll be a really informative session, I think.
Yeah, you can actually even use styles inside Illustrator. Unfortunately, they don't really help you much from an exporting standpoint, but they do help you keep a consistent, beautiful design, which I think is the part of the trick of using the right tools, right?
Absolutely. So today we wanted to talk about a topic that's really kind of near and dear to both Dax and my heart, which is why your document passes the checker but still fails users, right? Because we all rely on checkers, right? I mean, I'm not going to deny it. I mean, I rely on checkers. I even use the Acrobat checker, in my process. I'll often use the Acrobat checker to get a jump start, and then I'll kind of move on to more robust checkers like the PAC 2024 checker. But it's surprising how many times that I either receive a file from someone else or even documents that I've created, and they pass the checker, right? The checker says, good job, thumbs up, your document is compliant. And then I open it up and I start walking the tags tree, only to realize that, oh no, it is not accessible. It's violating, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's violating one of the key WCAG accessibility criteria, which is info and relationships, and maybe even meaningful sequence. So And the meaningful sequence, the order of your content, that's something a checker is never going to check for you, right? Like never think that a checker is going to tell you that your content is in the right order, because it doesn't know, right? I always say jokingly that checkers are dumb, right? Checkers are, when it comes to that kind of stuff, checkers are really dumb. And so a checker is never going to give you a thumbs up and say, yeah, everything looks like it's in the right order. Most checkers, especially the Acrobat checker, kind of gives you a warning that tells you that you as a human being need to check the order to make sure that it's reading in the correct order. So those are some of the things we're going to talk about, right, Dax?
Well, in Acrobat, as you said, right, it gives you always two warnings. Somebody asked me the other day, they're like, how do I clear these out? And I really wish there was a way that you can clear them out. You can make the check mark go away when you open it, but not when somebody else opens it. So I can right click on, it'll say logical reading order, and it'll say needs manual check. And there's a little blue question mark, right? And you can right click on that and say pass, right? And it goes away for you at the moment. You can save the document, and you would think that would save that setting in there. Nope. When you give it to somebody else and they go look at your checker report, it's going to say needs manual check again. And I just don't understand why Adobe, if you're listening, you don't let me make that stick.
Or even if you run the checker again, doesn't it like the error will pop back up, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So you can make yourself feel good temporarily by passing it, but it's always going to kind of come back and tell you that it needs manual check.
I just checked though, Chad, just to error check. If you manually pass it, it actually does stay manually passed when you're in the document and you've saved it. But if somebody else opens it and runs the checker, it's not gonna stick.
What if you close the document and reopen it?
All right, let's try that. So we're gonna save this hotel receipt. I was just in doing some offsite training, and I'm gonna open it back up and open recent files. And then I'm going to prepare for accessibility and check accessibility and run the checker. And I get logical reading order needs manual check. So in fact, it does not stick, not even for you.
Only for the session.
Only,
right?
Yes, only for the session. And then the other one is color contrast needs a manual check. And there's no color contrast tool that works inside Acrobat itself. So those are two things that we normally see. Now, I will tell you, Chad, right, that the categories inside the Acrobat checker are forms, alt text, tables, lists, and headings. It only checks for certain criteria in those categories. And then of course, page content. Does the page titled? Does it have tab order? Those types of things, right? I found out a funny little thing. If you have a table, I had a table that was in one of my training documents, and it was a blank table, like nothing was in it. It was just table with colors, right? I couldn't get it to pass the checker because it was a blank table. But what I did was I put the first, because it said table missing headers, right? Missing column or row headers. But what I did was I took the first row and I put it inside a T head folder, and it passed the table. Just the fact that the first row was in a T head, even though no content, no scope, nothing was set. Yeah. The fact that it just was in a T head folder, it passed. And I'm like,
and this is
why?
This is the Acrobat checker you're talking about,
yes,
right?
We're talking about the Acrobat checker, just in general. So I would think that it would check to see if there was a T head, but that it would also check to see if there was scope in the row, in the first row, to know that, hey, these THs are set to a scope of column. But it doesn't. They could be TDs, and as long as they're in the T head folder, then then it passes, which again goes back to the idea that you have to have a level of knowledge to understand what the user experience is, right?
Like I said, I feel like the Acrobat Checker is a good first step, typically,
Yep.
to kind of like help us identify any obvious issues, right? Like the Acrobat Checker is great for letting me know if I forgot to add alt text to my figures, right?
Yep.
Super helpful, right? It's like if I don't get that error in Acrobat, I'm certainly going to get it in the Pack Checker. So I might as well address it now while I'm here in Acrobat, or, you know, of course, go back to the source file. But there are times when the Acrobat Checker is not robust enough to understand proper tagging, right? And you and I have seen this. It is appropriate in a PDF file. For a lot of us, a lot of times when we do footnotes or endnotes, we will use the reference tag to identify the footnote reference.
Right.
But it is also acceptable to use the label tag to identify those references as well. Now, InDesign won't do it, Word won't do it, but if you're, for whatever reason, doing it manually and you prefer to use the label tag, it's completely acceptable. But the Acrobat Checker fails that. It says, whoa, you've got a label not in a list, so it has to be wrong. It has to be bad, right?
I'll challenge you though, Chad, because by default, I'll just add a keyword to it. By default, it checks for that, but you can actually turn that feature off.
Yeah. I mean, you could tell it not to check for that, right? So in the Acrobat Checker, if you dive into the subcategories, that you'll find an item that says label is in a list, right? And you could certainly uncheck that. And now when the Acrobat Checker checks your document, you know, but again, this gets back to, you need to have a high level of understanding in order to know that that's A, that it's not a problem, and B, how to get the Acrobat Checker to not identify it as a problem, right? It's a lot of knowledge that's required to fix it appropriately.
Well, you can, and people get really frustrated, especially new users who are really kind of bent on perfection, where they're like, look, I've learned the rule. The rule says this, PDF UA says this, or PDF UA 2 now says something new. And so they're trying to follow the guidelines, trying to be exacting about what they're doing. And then they go in and they get an error, a false positive or a false negative, or a screen reader user complains because it doesn't sound right, or they're here link, or, you know, something that they didn't expect. And then when you start to tell them, well, this is an idiosyncrasy of Pack, JAWS, the Acrobat Checker, Apple VoiceOver, right? You pick any one of those. They're like, why? This is extremely frustrating. How am I supposed to do my job when 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2? Right? I mean, there's some absolute facts you'd love to know for sure, that if I was just looking at a document the other day, it's a scientific document and it had a bunch of formulas in it. And the symbol they used was the X for the times. And it wasn't the actual letter X. It was the math symbol for times. And unfortunately, NVDA read it as number. Why did you read it as number? So it said, you know, whatever variable, number, whatever variable, instead of variable times variable. So it was very like head scratching. And unfortunately, this is the world we live in, where you really have to have your chops, right? It's why the IAAP requires 1 to 2 years of doing accessibility before you can get apply to get your ADS or WAS, because there's some stuff you got to just learn as you go.
And we're honestly very far from anything close to perfection, you know, with document accessibility, right? We are like light years away from ever being, you know, anywhere near close to some type of, you know, perfection, because there's always issues like this that we're going to have to deal with. And the only way to really understand it is to improve your knowledge, you know?
Yeah.
And to understand that, okay, I'm getting this error. Why am I getting this error? Right. And even, when we run into the pack checker, we often get an error that says inappropriate use of a certain structure element, right?
Yep.
And you get that for a number of different reasons. You can get it if you have a table inside of a P tag. You'll get it if you have a figure at the root level of your tag structure. A link, if you have a link at the root level, right? Or if you have a figure as a child of a link, right?
Yeah.
And now where I run into that quite a bit is when people include QR codes in their design.
Right.
And we've talked about this before, Dax, and so I don't want to dwell on it, but I always say, like, when you have a QR code, my recommendation is under the QR code, put the URL that the QR code goes to. Makes for a very easy, very seamless experience for the user. But a lot of times they'll just put the QR code and it'll say scan here, right?
Right.
Well, again, for somebody who's non-sighted, what do you expect them to do? Like randomly hover their phone over the document, hoping they hit the QR code so they can get where they need to go? No, that's not a good choice. So what I do is I make the QR code a link, and I make sure that link will take them to where the QR code would take them. But when you do that, you now have a link that's at the root level of the tag structure, and inside of that link, you have a figure tag. Well, that figure needs to be an inline level element, not a block level element. And conversely, when the figure is at the root level of the tag structure, that needs to be a block level element and not an inline level element. Now, I don't want to confuse people. I know I've dived deep into the weeds on that one, but that's a classic example of where the PDF UA standard wants those elements to be have an appropriate property assigned to them for the best user experience. Now, between you and me, Dax, if I'm using a screen reader and those figures do not have the block level attribute assigned to them, it still reads just fine.
Yeah.
Right. It's not an issue.
But to compound the issue, there is a whole nother error that goes along with this. Because when you have a figure, you have to have alt text. When you have a link, you have to have alt text.
On the link.
And when you have a link with alt text and a figure with alt text, the checker says, nope, you can't have nested alt text. You get an error for nested alt text because it's saying you have an object with alt text, and as a child of that object, you have another object with alt text, and it doesn't read it. So you get nested alt text error. So then what do you have to do? Well, you have to make the figure and the link as siblings as the same level. They can't be one inside the other when they both have alt text, because the QR code, it has to have alt text to say QR code for whatever, and the link has to have alt text that says wherever the link's going. And so it falls back into the problem of when you do that, now you got to make sure that the block level or inline level element is set correctly too. So there's a series of cascading failures that happen when you're trying to solve one thing. It creates another issue when you're like, why can't InDesign just do this the right way? Or Word, do this the right way and let me treat these elements in the way that follows the rules. And, the reality is there's a disconnect between the rules and the program and the screen reader. There's this dichotomy. There's this triangle of everyone wants to point the finger at somebody else, and the end user is the one who pays the price. Absolutely. And honestly, the remediator pays the price because you're paying this person to fix your document and make it accessible. And when they either have to spend 3 times the amount of time to get it done right, or they do it where they think it's right, and then you get it back and say, nope, it's not right. Some customer complained. Now they look insufficient and like they don't know their job, when the reality is they're trying to follow the rules.
Well, and I'll give you another example, Dax. I had a document the other day. Somebody provided me with a PDF that they created from Adobe InDesign. Every bullet in the document was mapped to a P tag.
Yep.
209 of them.
Wow.
And I'm like, you know what I mean? What's the right answer, right? I guess the ideal situation, I should have gone back to the client and said, send me the InDesign file. I'll fix this, right? But I didn't have the ability to do that. So now I've got this PDF file and it violates info and relationships, right? All of those bullets are not tagged appropriately. And so the client had to pay me to fix all of them, right? And I mean, I even hate spending my time doing that, right? I mean, my time's way better spent in other areas, but when you come across that problem, you know, I can't let it go either, right? I mean, especially you and I, Dax, right? I mean, you and I have to walk the walk. And so if I would have let that slide and somebody would have seen that document and knew that I remediated it, that would look really bad. So it had to be fixed.
Well, I think there's, just for everyone listening's benefit, there is a balance between time, effort, and barrier. You have, on one hand, how long is it going to take me to do this? Is it possible to do it? And what's the barrier if I don't? If my document had 600 bullets in the document, let's just say let's be more realistic. Let's say it's a 100-page document and there are 200 bullets because there's lists with 5 or 6 items, right? It is not that big of a deal for a person to hear bullet item 1, bullet item 2, bullet item 3, right? But if there are 50 items in that list, that's a huge barrier for the screen reader user. So I think what I would have done, and if I'm just remediator working for my own company, trying to get through the day and make this document accessible, I would pick my battles. And I would say, let me scan through this document. Are there any bulleted lists here that are more than, and I would pick a number. Me personally, I might pick 6. I think if you have a bulleted list that has more than 6 items, I think knowing how many items are in that list is pretty important. So I might scan the document, you know, just go through it. Now I'd use Common Look to scan for the a P tag with a bullet symbol. And then I would find those. And all you have to do is grab all of them in one shot, change them from a P tag to an LI, and give them a parent tag of an L. It's not that big of a deal when you can identify the 6 or 8 places where the lists are long, and it really would be a barrier. Because the reality is, you know, a bullet list with 2 or 3 or 4 items, not that big of a barrier.
No.
It does violate info and relationships. I 100% agree, but it's that balance of time, effort, and barrier.
And I'm with you on that, right? Like if you've got 3 bullets under a heading, I don't know that I care too much. But in this document, it was a whole page of bulleted items.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And so now the user is going to read that heading, and then they're going to start reading these paragraphs, and they're going to go, and they got to go through. Whereas if it's tagged properly, they're going to read the heading and it's going to say list with 27 items. Yeah. And if they're like, I don't care, I don't want to read 27 items, let's move on, right? You know what I mean? It gives them the option for the better user experience.
Now, I will say to people who are listening to this podcast, who design those types of documents, you're creating the content. It is structurally important to make sure that if you've got a long list, that there is a heading after that list. There is no way to just say skip list. You cannot just tell the screen reader program to just move past the element I'm on. You can move to the next known element, which in this case we're hoping will be a heading or a graphic or a table or some other identifiable thing. But if I can't see the content, I have no idea. So what would happen is, if you're structuring the document, give those headings as landmarks so that a person can go, oh, this is a list with 100 items. I'm going to press the H key to move to the next heading. And then I'm going to fact check myself. And this is what I do as a screen reader user when I'm trying to really test the content. I'll just go up, which is backward, right? So if I go from that list with 50 items, I press H to go to the next heading, and then I press the up arrow. And what do I want to hear? I want to hear that last bullet item. And that tells me that I just skipped the list and that I didn't skip other content that might have been on that page.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a really good technique, Dax, of just kind of orienting yourself in the document, right? I mean, that's really what we're talking about here. But I know, like, I have one client in some of their documents, on the last page of the document, they list all of the zip codes that they serve.
Sure.
Right. And it's like 200 zip codes. Mm-hmm. Right. And so what I do is I make them, I use a little trick, right? So I make them bulleted items, but then I make the bullet like a micro bullet. I make it like 0.1 points or something like that. And then I change the color to white or paper so that they don't see them. But when they're reading it, it says zip codes. And then it says list with 250 items. And they're like, not doing it. Right. And then they can, navigate away from it. And in that case, it's the last thing in the document. So there's really nowhere to go beyond that. But if they do start reading the list and they don't want to, they can go back to the previous heading or, use some technique like that to avoid hearing it. But I think these are great things for people to kind of keep in mind as they're building their documents. I think they're important, and they present the user with a much better user experience.
And the reality is, if you're going to get presented with a list of 50 items, it's likely you're going to search for some kind of content. You're just going to press Control F and you're going to pull up, hey, do they serve my zip code 95662? And then you would hear, it would bounce you to that item, and you would hear bullet 95662, and you would go, great. There it is, right there, right?
They serve my region. That's all I wanted to know, right?
You might be looking for someone's name or some kind of course, right? You're typically not going to try to hunt through that list to figure out what's going on, right? Unless you're just trying to discover, I wonder what kind of courses they have. We were just looking at a course catalog for a college just the other day, and all those headings were not headings. They were just bold text with unbolded subtext underneath it. And literally you'd have to press a down arrow like 100 times just to get halfway through the first couple columns.
Well, and that's the document you and I were looking at, Dax, and it had like a very long list of items.
Yep. Majors and then subtopics. Yeah,
exactly. And so you and I made the suggestion of adding a letter as a heading for each letter of the alphabet. Sure. So that the user could jump to the R's, right? If they're looking for like radiology, I don't know. I'm going off the cuff here, right? But if they're looking for radiology, they could say, you know what? Let's go through the headings, and they only have to press the H key, say 20 times, and then they get to R. They're like, aha, that's where I want to be. Now read the R's to me. And then it can say, oh yeah, they do have radiology, or they do have reflexology, whatever you're looking for. It's that navigation is key, right? Because otherwise you are making people work, right? They are working very hard to get to the information they're trying to consume. Yeah.
Well, there are really two things to consider here. The one that you've heard us say, if you listen to this podcast, you hear us say more times than not. I've almost even thought about getting it tattooed right in this open spot on my arm. What do you want the user experience to be? You have to think about and understand what are the options for the user experience. But also, I had a meeting with a client this morning, and they said, we talked about the solutions. And I said, it really falls into three categories: good, better, and best. And good means it passes with CAG. There's no major barriers. There's basic navigation. And that would be, I don't care if there's a list of 100 items. It's in a list tag. There's a heading. Whether there's a heading after it or not, doesn't matter. It's appropriately tagged. Then there would be better, right? Better would be there's a heading and I've separated my list and I made sure that there is an anchored item after the list that the user knows that they can then, skip that whole block of content. And then best would be the idea of separating that long list by subcategories. In your case, in this case, A, B, C, alphabetical. Maybe it's by county or by region or whatever the item may be, but giving them subsets of items, right? And it's that type of experience where you go, there is a good experience, there is a better experience, and then there's the best experience. What does my time allow me to do? What do I want the user experience to be? And what creates the least amount of barriers? And somewhere in there is your solution. And it's up to you and your organization to figure out what that is, or reach out to us, right? You can always reach out to us at solutions@chaxtc.com, and we can sit down with you and kind of go over what those options are. I spent an hour and a half this morning going over those options for this client who's got a really complex situation with a bunch of math in their document. So, if you don't have the answer or you can't figure out how to triage through the problem, we're here to help you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So kind of getting back to, when the checker or when your document passes the checker, but it still fails for the users. I think another situation, and I feel like this is something I'm seeing less and less of, but there was a period of time where people would try to cheat with alt text and they would just put a space in the alt text field, right? Because that will pass all of the checkers, right? The checker is simply looking at a figure to see if there's text in the alt text field.
Except for the pack checker. The pack checker will look at that space and tell you that you do not have tech that's not there. So you might get away with that with the Acrobat checker, but the pack checker is going to still flag you.
Yeah.
But people do that because they're used to the HTML way, right? In HTML, when you want to artifact something, you add a space to the alt text, and then that basically makes it invisible. In a PDF, you can designate it as a decorative element, and that creates a tag called an artifact tag. And then that becomes removed from the tags tree and hidden in the content pane so that it's still detectable as a decorative element to other technology, but to a screen reader, it's ignored, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So let's talk about the role. We've been talking about testing, right? As we've been talking about, we did this and this is how we tested it. And here's what the experience was. But the role of a manual screen reader tester, most of the time, we as creators are also the people testing the documents. But we work with an organization where there are writers that write the content, designers that design the content, and testers that validate that the document meets accessibility. And in that organization, we've gotten some feedback from those testers where they're like, I opened the PowerPoint in PowerPoint Viewer and I'm listening with this screen. I told it to read aloud and it's this experience. And the reality is that as a tester, you have to define what the parameters are in which you're testing your document, because you can use Microsoft Narrator to try to read stuff. You could use JAWS or NVDA, which is a layer on top of that. You could use Apple VoiceOver. You could do lots of different things. But if you don't know what your baseline testing environment is, it's really hard to know whether or not something is truly accessible or not.
It absolutely is. It absolutely is. And, you and I had a meeting earlier today, Dax, with a client, and they had asked us what we recommend as a QC approach, right?
Right.
For QCing a document. And what we basically said is like, that's something that you as an organization need to decide, right? That's really not something that I mean, we can advise you, right? We can make recommendations, but fundamentally you as an organization have to make that decision to decide, okay, this is, either A, what we believe in, or B, what we, what our expectation is of how the document will be consumed, and then, kind of go from there.
Well, I think a big part of that is training for everyone. And this is not to toot our own horn here, but some of the organizations we work with, their legal team has no idea how to write alt text, but they're the ones in charge of validating whether or not that alt text is appropriate or not. And we've seen huge volumes of alt text because every single value that was visible in the bar chart that was 20 bars long got dumped into alt text because that's what they said they needed to do. That person in legal didn't understand the role and responsibility of reviewing that alt text. So with great power comes great responsibility. And when we walk you through how to understand and evaluate documents for accessibility, we talk about that, and training is a big part of it, because if my job is to validate that the document is accessible, but I don't understand really what that means, then everything I say is all with, is tainted. It is just not going to be accurate. It might be somewhat accessible or maybe technically accessible, but there are no rules for how long alt text should be. There are guidelines. And every organization you go to, you'll hear something like 2 to 3 sentences, 250 characters. But the reality is the description should be long enough to describe meaningful elements of the figure. Whether that's 2 sentences or 10 sentences, if I can do it in 2, do it in 2. Mm-hmm. But if it takes 10, it takes 10. And then at that point, you have to go, well, is it a barrier to read these 10 sentences? And then we teach people things like having an appendix in the back with expanded descriptions so that you can have these really long descriptions that will be a lot more user-friendly because it's just text, right? Brock College is one of those ones. We have an example document from them. They do a great job of putting that content in the very end of the document and giving the user basically just regular paragraph text that references the bar chart or line graph or table, and it allows for a much easier user experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I've been noticing, I don't know about you, Chad, but used to be, we would say that the pack checker doesn't understand color contrast when it comes to white text or colored text and a background color. And I know that you've talked about in previous podcasts, and we even have a post on our website, Accessibility Unraveled, that you wrote about the previous barrier where some people use an underline and then they behind text to offset it so that it works like a background. But what I've noticed is even the text that has been overlaid on top of photos and other types of usage isn't giving me the false positive or false negative that it used to give me. I wonder if they've improved that algorithm where it's not really doing that anymore, or maybe I'm just not coming across the types of documents that trigger that false positive.
Well, that's a really good point that you're bringing up, because I literally ran into this, just a couple of days ago, where I had white text on a black bar. Like that's how they formatted their headings, and it was failing. And I'm like, what's the deal? Like it doesn't get any better, right? You know what I mean? I can't make it any better. And when I couldn't help myself, so I had to dive in and take a look. And it turns out that black bar was a stroked path, not a filled shape.
Oh, because it was a stroke. Gotcha.
The pack checker cannot identify a stroke, but it can identify a fill shape. So what I ended up doing, just because it drove me crazy, I went in and edited the line in Illustrator, converted the stroke to a filled shape, everything passed, right?
I figured out why this is, Chad, why it is. Think about a bounding box for an image, right? A bounding box, everybody gets the B box errors. It's because the 4 coordinates, the top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right points of origin are in a certain region. It defines the area in which the image lives. Well, a stroke only has 2 points. It's only linear.
Mm-hmm.
It's point A and point B. But a path has 4 points. A box has 4 points. And so it can then use those 4 points of reference to say, do the 4 points of this range overlap with the 4 points of the text range? And if it does, then it is by definition behind or in front of this object. And that's why the path doesn't compute, because it's just 2 points. That makes a lot of sense. I hadn't really thought of it that way.
Well, and what I did, I took it a step further, because Acrobat has a feature called the transparency flattener.
Sure.
And one of the features that's available in the transparency flattener is you could tell it to outline every stroke in the document.
Oh, that's great.
In theory, it is.
Uh-oh.
It ended up obliterating the tag structure.
Oh,
because you're kind of changing an item from one thing to another.
Oh, the Form X objects. All those Form X objects are all going to change into something different. That makes a lot of sense.
Now, the transparency flattener also exists in Adobe InDesign, but only when you export to the PDF format using the print setting, not the interactive setting.
So if you do it in the beginning as you're exporting with tags, it's all good and fine. But if you got to do it after the fact when you're in the PDF, that's when it messes everything up. That makes sense.
And I know for me, I'm almost always outputting to the interactive format, especially because I'm using made to tag.
Yeah.
Now, I did reach out to the folks at Exeo, and apparently they are working on an output method based on the print setting.
Oh, good.
So in the future, we may get a tool that we can use to kind of improve that situation. But I know we went off a little bit off the rails on that one, but I think it's worth having the discussion, because I'm sure other people are running into the same problem when they're, running their document through the checker, and they're like, this is white text on black. How can it not pass, color contrast? And it's frustrating, but
Well, Chad, as we close out here, I just want to let people know this is an exciting year. We have really grown. We are now almost 60 people, 16 or 18 full-time Chax employees that moved from 2 to now a whole cadre and growing. And this year is the first year that Chax has had a booth at Adobe Max. And so I am so excited, because you and I are going to be at that booth at Adobe Max, and we might have some really cool swag. So come stop by our booth and say hi to us. If nothing else, get a photo and a sticker sheet. We've got a really cool set of stickers, and we might even have some other stuff. We're looking at maybe some mailing tubes for your posters, maybe even a poster or some pins. Might even have some mints. Who knows? Definitely breath is a whole thing at Adobe Max. You go walk around, don't have a whole lot of time, but man, people love grabbing those mints. So swing by our booth. I don't have our booth number in front of us, but I'm sure you can find it if you look up the booth for Chax. But yeah, I'm ecstatic. I couldn't be happier to have that booth. So.
Yeah, we'd love to see everybody. We appreciate your support watching the Chax Chat podcast. We love that you enjoy the content that we create, but we'd love it even more if we got to meet you in person. So if you're planning on heading to Adobe Max this year, which is the end of October, I want to say 27th to 30th.
It's the 28th to the 30th. Yeah.
Okay. So, but yeah, we'd love to see you, and we hope to see you there at Max this year.
Stop by and ask me about my trip into Dubai, because I will have just gotten back from Dubai. I will be teaching at a conference in Dubai the first week of October. So, stop by the booth and ask how it went.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. And again, hope to see you guys at Adobe Max this year. My name is Chad Chilius.
And my name is Dax Castro, where every other week we unravel accessibility for you.
Thanks, guys.